Calls for an international investigation in Ethiopia after more than 100 people are killed in demonstrations. It's the worst ethnic violence in decades. What is behind the unrest and what can be done to ensure the Ethiopian government respects human rights? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Fuli Batibo. It's a conflict that has led to 500 deaths since November, according to rights groups, 100 of them in the last week alone. The Ethiopian government is cracking down hard on ethnic Oromos and Amharas who are calling for political reforms. Human rights groups have called the response ruthless, and the United Nations wants to send international observers to investigate. But the Ethiopian government has denied that request, saying it alone is responsible for the security of its citizens. Charles Stratford has more from Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa.
There seems to be a growing solidarity between the two ethnic groups that are driving these protests, the Amhara and the Oromo. These have traditionally been rival ethnic groups in this country, always vying for more political power. And this seems to have taken the government by surprise. The government is blaming these protests on what it describes as people with terror links that are stoking violence amongst the protesters. It's also blaming activists living abroad, and that's why analysts are saying we've seen these blockages of the internet and social media as the worst protests have taken place. Now, the government says that it is willing to speak to the protesters about their grievances, but the fact remains that the majority of opposition leaders have either been locked up in jail or have fled the country. The United Nations has called for UN human rights observers to be stationed in the worst affected areas, and the government has said that that's not necessary at this stage, seemingly not wanting any outside interference. 500 people, according to human rights groups, have been killed in months of protests in this country so far. The protesters have vowed to continue to get on the streets and air their grievances, and it seems like the government is struggling to maintain control.
Well, the recent protests in Ethiopia are a result of decades of ethnic tension. The Tigray ethnic group has dominated national politics for years, but it only represents about 6% of the population. Meanwhile, the Oromos are the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. They make up more than 1/3 of the population. And the Amharas, who are also protesting, are the second largest group, representing about 1/5 of the population. Oromos and Amharas have been complaining about political and economic marginalization, and they also say they've been targeted by police over the years, that authorities arrest them without cause and charge them unfairly. But the Ethiopian government has dismissed those accusations, calling them unfounded. Well, we'll talk to our guests in just a moment, but first let's speak to Tsedale Lema. She's a journalist who has been covering the Oromo protests for the last 9 months. She joins us on the line from Addis Ababa. Tsedale, thank you so much for talking to us. The UN Human Rights Commissioner has described the news from Ethiopia as extremely alarming. Tell us about what happened during the recent protests and what the situation is now.
Well, the protests originally began in April, May 2014, and the starting point was the Oromo people's question for the federal government to hold or to bring to the discussion with the people of the master plan, which has come now an infamous starting point. What is happening right now is a widespread protest throughout, I would say, the Oromia regional state, in most parts in the Amhara regional state as well. So as journalists who've been trying to cover the issue, I am extremely not at ease to tell you what exactly is happening, because our ability to go around and report on exactly what's happening outside of the capital is extremely constrained by the excessive presence of the federal army in most places where the protests are happening. What is happening within the social media and calls that we are receiving as media, these protests are pretty much covering both regions now from end to end. So that's what's happening right now. And the worst of it being the protest last weekend.
You spoke about the difficulties, Tsedale, of covering this story. You've covered this conflict extensively. Tell us more about what you've experienced as a journalist trying to report on this story. Give us specific examples of how it's been difficult for you to get to the heart of the story itself.
Well, there was a statement, for example, yesterday that was released by the Association of Foreign Journalists in Ethiopia, highlighting the incident in which 3 of the members have been arrested and they across the country when they were going out to cover that. This is not the first time it has happened. This was the second time within the last 9 months since the start of the second round of protests. We face the same problem when we are trying to cover that. Going outside of the capital to these places, particularly places where, for example, in Ambu, which is just 125 kilometers west of the capital here, the fact that the security presence there makes our work extremely difficult and also sends the signal to the people that they cannot come out to tell their stories to journalists. So the people are also intimidated. And whenever we have that encounter with security forces, we cannot say that openly we are journalists who are there to cover the protest. So this has made it extremely difficult for us to report on what exactly is happening in these places.
Okay, thank you so much, Tsedale, for taking the time to speak to us. Tsedale Lema, Ethiopian journalist, joining us there on the line from Addis. Thank you. Well, let's now bring in our other guests for today's Inside Story. Joining us from Addis Ababa is Getachew Reda. He's the Ethiopian Communications Affairs Minister for the government. In Nairobi, we have Felix Horn, Ethiopia researcher for Human Rights Watch. And in Lansing, Michigan, in the United States, we're joined by Ezekiel Gebisa, Professor of History and African Studies at Kettering University. Thank you all, gentlemen, for being on Inside Story. Mr. Reda in Addis Ababa, if I may begin with you, how does the Ethiopian government justify using deadly force against protesters? In Bahir Dar alone, 30 people died last Sunday. What happened?
You see, sometimes when you assume numbers without even having to check whether that is actually what happened on the ground, as Tsedale earlier was saying, she has this contrived difficulty of having access to protesters in some part of the country, and yet it doesn't prevent her from making up all kinds of stories about what has happened on the ground, when in fact she's complaining about not having had access, which I believe, because I know Tsedale, she has hardly had any problem.
But that wasn't my
having
question,
access to
Mr.
things.
Reda. My question to you is not about the journalists getting access. We'll get to that in just a moment. Let me just ask you my question, because international, everyone has seen the pictures of Ethiopian security forces kicking protesters. My question to you is, why is the Ethiopian security, or why are the security forces using deadly force against protesters?
Look, security forces are taking measured responses when there are violent protesters and when people are particularly using deadly force against security forces and against civilians in the name of protesters. Of course, you would expect the security forces to respond in kind. But for you to assume that whatever numbers are being plucked out of thin air by activists are actually the facts on the ground, that would give journalism a very bad name. So what I'm saying is, in Bahir Dar, what happened in Bahir Dar was the protesters, although not authorized, were going. The people were chanting whatever slogans they had. One doesn't have to agree with whatever slogans that were being chanted by the people. But what mattered, at the end of the day, there was a violent incident involving people among the protesters throwing grenades at institutions and at people. And of course, the security forces would normally respond when there is a violent reaction involved.
Okay, we've heard your response. Let me bring in Felix Horn of Human Rights Watch. Right. Felix Horn, Mr. Reda says the numbers are wrong, the numbers are exaggerated, and that these were not peaceful protesters. What is your response?
Well, he's right in one way. The access is restricted for civil society, for media, which makes it very difficult to ascertain the numbers definitively. Having said that, Human Rights Watch released a report in June that documented the killings of at least 400 protesters. That's based on hundreds of interviews with victims, with witnesses, and with perpetrators too, with his own security forces and with OPDO officials who corroborated many of these stories. There can be no justification for the shooting of unarmed protesters, of the detention of tens of thousands, and of the torture and detention that we continuously hear about, and where people physically show us the scars that they have endured through that torture. Now, there were some acts of violence by protesters, that is true, but there was very, very minor from what we could gather, and certainly doesn't justify the brutal and lethal response that is really enraging and ensuring that these protests will continue.
Before I bring in Ezekiel Gebisa, Mr. Red, I just want to ask you, if, as you say, these are not peaceful protesters, if the Ethiopian government has nothing to hide and nothing to be blamed for as far as the protests were handled last weekend, why wouldn't you allow international observers in to investigate?
I don't know why at this point we are all of a sudden interested in international observers, because the government is working with the people, and most of the people in some parts of Oromia and Amhara where this protests took place are already having extensive consultations with the government. And of course, it is only the people in the government who have every right and every power to address whatever grievances there are, which have given rise to people protesting out in the streets. Whether those protests turn out to be violent or peaceful, ultimately the decision is going to be for the people in the government.
But the Ethiopian government, Mr. Reda, has time and time again said that it's open for business. The Ethiopian government has said it's open for business, that it's open to the international community. So why not allow observers in?
Why? I mean, you see, the most fascinating part of this human rights, UN human rights observers thing is, probably the UN has the third largest mission, probably the second largest mission in the world, here in Addis Ababa. Human resources are never in short supply in this part of the world. And why would we be interested in a certain investigation panel when in fact the government, a very responsible government, and responsible people are ahead of the matter and trying to address whatever challenges there are? And simply because we are trying to inflate figures of casualties and fatalities, simply because we are trying to create a cloud of suspicion and fear throughout the country, that doesn't make it right. What's happening in this country is there are people who are legitimately protesters against all kinds of governance issues, and of course the government understands that, and we have to address this challenge because we owe to our people.
Okay.
And this is the government which is responsible, and of course we will continue to address the challenge of the people.
Well, let's try to understand the issues.
Why external people who are halfway across the world would have a better understanding of the situation on the ground.
Well, let's try to understand the issues for people who may not be familiar with what's going on in Ethiopia right now. Let's bring in Ezekiel Gebisa in Lansing, Michigan. Ezekiel, the bitter feelings from the Oromo and Amhara communities have existed for years, of course. This is nothing new. We've had separatist groups like the Oromo Liberation Front, the Ogaden National Liberation Front that have been vanquished. So a lot of people are wondering, why is this all resurfacing now? Why is it all exploding now again? What's happening here?
A quarter century of rule by the TPLF, people now feel that their democratic rights, their economic security, their personhood are not respected. Their personal security are not respected. People don't have the regularity of life. They can't go out and come back home safely. This is what is happening, that it's not even a question of politics or economic or constitutional rights. It's a basic human security that people cannot go out and come home because the government has all kinds of laws, anti-terrorism law, press law, anti-charities law, that people cannot exercise the basic human rights that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is what the cause is, that people just cannot go out and come back home safely. There is no regularity of life. Everything is violated. The government is exercising the rule of violence rather than the rule of law. It's the rule of by law rather than the rule of law. The government could say all kinds of things, but people around the world are able to see on social media different kinds of images that people who are exercising their constitutional right, their the federal right, are simply shot.
Okay, let me, we still don't know what precisely the people that we've seen on the streets, what they're demanding. Let me bring in Felix Horn, because you know this region very well. You know Ethiopia, Eritrea. The people that we've seen protesting, the government has dismissed them as social media activists, rejectionists. Tell us, Felix, who exactly is on the street right now? What are they protesting for? What are their demands?
I mean, I think in Oromia and Amhara there are different demands, but In Oromia, the underlying causes, the underlying demands are about the government's approach to development and the potential for displacement of Oromos from their lands. It's increasingly about the conduct of security forces and the continued use of lethal force. And it's about decades of discrimination and human rights abuses by successive governments. In Amhara region, where the protests have only started in the last couple of weeks, it's about that domination of the TPLF and the inequities around economic and political power, and it's about ethnic identity. And as Ezekiel mentioned, this all takes place in a broader context of lack of ability to peacefully express dissent, whether that's through the media, through civil society, through the electoral process where the ruling coalition has 100% of the seats. So this just means there's no place to peacefully express dissent, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such an explosion on the streets of Ethiopia today.
Let's ask Minister Reda about this, the issue of being able to express dissent. Mr. Reda, many of the activists inside Ethiopia that we've reached out to ourselves here at Al Jazeera have told us they won't speak to us because they are not feeling safe speaking to us. They feel insecure, under threat. One activist that I actually spoke to on the phone today told me that he'd received death threats and that he wouldn't come and speak to us on Al Jazeera. So why is the Ethiopian government stifling expression? What's happening here?
Look, I mean, if somebody thinks they're going to be arrested because they say something out in public, well, I would say they are entitled to their own opinion, but they must be lying through their teeth, because Tzadala, as you said, is one of the most vocal journalists in this country. She was speaking to you on the phone from Addis. She doesn't have the list of fear, if you will. Her coverage of the circumstances in parts of Oromia have been outrageous, as far as I'm concerned. But still, she has every right to say whatever she wants us to say. The thing is,
so are you denying that the government has intermittently, for instance, cut off the internet to not allow people to protest? Why cut off the internet, for instance, then, if people are allowed to say whatever they want?
We didn't cut up the internet. We imposed a limited ban on social media for 3 days, and because social media, as you might think, if you think it's the most solid and the most dependable source of correct information, and then of course you don't have any clear idea of what social media does, because it was being used to churn out false information after false information, mostly seditious remarks, trying to agitate people, not just against security forces, but also against fellow brothers and sisters. And of course, as a responsible government, we decided to put on hold the kinds of vitriol that was running around social media. But that ban, after 3 years, was lifted. Now, having said that, in this country, you see, we are trying to create a society which fully accommodates diversity, a political order which fully addresses the rights and human rights, human and democratic rights of the people. Of course, we have a long way to go before we can achieve the kind of stellar democratic order that the rest of the world thinks.
Felix doesn't seem to agree with you on that. Felix, what has the government done to address these concerns?
We have tons of problems. We have problems here and there, but we are on the right track because we are working with the people, simply because people halfway across the world are trying to give you a concocted idea of what the reality
let's allow the others to respond, Mr. Reda. Let's allow Felix, for instance, to respond. Felix in Nairobi, you disagree with what Mr. Reda has said. He says that they've addressed some of these concerns. Maybe they haven't done well and they're still trying to do so, but they are addressing the concerns. What do you respond?
By any measure, Ethiopia's human rights trajectory is getting substantially worse. I mean, he handpicks certain examples to show that the media freedoms, for example, are present in the country. But if you look at the overall trajectory, Ethiopia is still one of the largest jailers of journalists in the entire continent. There are many, many journalists, hundreds of journalists, in fact, that have fled Ethiopia because they feared arrest. I mean, this is the reality. It's getting substantially worse. To go back to his earlier point about the lack of need for international observers, I mean, Ethiopia has shown no willingness to ever investigate or hold to account security forces implicated in abuses. This goes back to the 2003 massacre in Gambela, when Human Rights Watch believed that the abuses amounted to crimes against humanity, or in the Somali region where war crimes were committed by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, there was no desire to investigate. In terms of the current protests, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, that has the mandate to investigate these sorts of abuses, presented a verbal report to Parliament in June, where they came to the conclusion that the use of force was proportional to the risk that the security forces faced. Now, no written report has ever been released that would justify such a seemingly politicized conclusion, and I would encourage Getachew to please ensure that report is released so we can understand how that conclusion was arrived at. But the complete impunity with which security forces operate sends a very dangerous message to young Ethiopians.
Okay, well, I want to talk about the international response, or lack thereof, some people would say, that there has been about the recent protests. Despite the months of unrest, as we've seen in Ethiopia, the international community has been relatively quiet about it. There has been condemnation, but again, Ethiopia has long been an ally of the West, and the European Union is offering it trade incentives in return for help containing the ongoing refugee crisis in Europe. The US sends Ethiopia millions of dollars in aid every year. They rely on Ethiopia as a security partner in the region. It has been a crucial part of the fight against Al-Shabaab in Somalia, for instance. Ezekiel Gebisa, given all this, given the relationship that we've seen between Ethiopia and Western countries, the US and the European Union, can we expect any sort of condemnation of the recent protests, a stronger condemnation anyway?
We are seeing some responses from the European Union and even from the United States Congress. I think the idea that this government could continue to be a security partner for the West is really diminishing by the day, because a government that is using strong arm tactics, shooting at its own people, cannot be a reliable security partner. I think that there's growing realization around the world because of the Oromo protest and the blatant disregard of human rights and the killing of people with impunity has enraged even the world community. It has really rubbed people around the world in the wrong way. Government cannot continue to do that. They have to address the issues. They have to confront the issues that are bedeviling Ethiopia. They have to listen to the people.
Okay.
The demands are legitimate. They're saying on the one hand, demands are legitimate. On the other hand, they shoot at them. This cannot be sustained. They understand that they should be able to talk to people. They should go back to the democratization process. Otherwise, even world public opinion is going to turn against them when they are killing 8-year-old and 8-year-old.
Okay, let's allow Mr. Reda to respond. Let's allow Mr. Reda to respond. Mr. Reda in Addis Ababa, Mr. Gebisa says that the Ethiopian government can't be seen as a reliable partner by the international community if it continues with these abuses. Your response?
I have heard him loud and clear. I mostly agree with what Ezekiel has to say about the government having the government's responsibility to talk to the people, because ultimately legitimacy crisis at home. It's not so much the function of whether the West considers us an ally or not that ensures the stability of this country. Ultimately, the stability of this country depends on whether or not the government is able to accommodate the interests of its people, whether or not it is ready to address the grievances of its people. And of course, we are mindful of the need for consulting our people on every issue that arises, whether this is in terms of governance, whether this is in terms of security, whatever. So ultimately, the legitimacy of this government and the continuity, if you will, of the state will depend on how effective it is in addressing the grievances of the public. So whether or not our friends in the West or in the East will still consider us an ally against whatever international or global or regional challenge there is only a function of how strong we are at home.
Okay.
So yes, we are working on it. And as far as we are concerned, what matters to us is not whether the rest of the world thinks of us as a dependable ally, because what matters to us is whether or not we are able to deliver to our people, whether or not we are able to address whatever challenge that our people face. That's the most important part of the story.
Okay, thank you so much. We're going to leave it there. Thank you so very much for a very interesting discussion. Getachew Reda, Felix Horn, and Ezekiel Gebisa. Thank you all for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Foliba Thibault, and the whole team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.